Hello, genealogists. This is Craig, and this is Just Genealogy. And today we will continue with genealogy as pastime and profession. This is chapter 12, Source Material Original. Take ye the sum of all the congregation of the children of Israel after their families by the house of their fathers. Numbers. And Abraham begot Isaac. Chronicles. When it comes to searching original records, the most important factor is the ability of the genealogist who does the searching. Again, we should like to quote Mr. William Bradford Brown, who states that genealogy is a science which requires years of preparation and is only successfully acquired by a person naturally adapted to its study and to whom its drudgery is pleasure and not work. It means the power to read or decipher ancient records, to understand their meaning, to read them with the understanding of obsolete meanings. It means a knowledge of law sufficient to understand the why and where, for of papers of a legal nature. It requires the intimate knowledge of towns, counties, and states, so that the genealogist knows where certain records are at stated periods and how these towns and counties have been divided and at what times. It requires the knowledge of the changes of the calendar from the old arrangement to the new. No genealogist is so proficient that he can search records in all localities equally well. Many now specialize in certain areas with the records of which they are thoroughly familiar, and often they can obtain better results and at less cost to their special territory than could any other genealogist less familiar with it. For many years, I have employed other genealogists in other sections of the country as occasion arose, and was employed at times by other genealogists who desired research in my special field. This saves traveling expenses, at least, and usually the arrangement has worked out well. But there are not always competent searchers in all sections, or one does not always learn of them. Again, a professional genealogist, dependent on his work for a livelihood, may not feel he can afford to turn a piece of research over to a genealogist living in the proper territory unless, at the moment, he has enough commissions that he can work on it personally. There are several genealogical handbooks which give information as to where records are located in certain sections. None that I have seen gives the reader much idea as to just how he should work with original records when he has located them. This is a matter in which experience is the best teacher, but to give the general reader an idea of how the problems are solved, a few case histories will be set forth in the next chapter, following each step of the research. Here we cannot even attempt to instruct the reader as to the location of different classes of records throughout the entire country. Frankly, I admit that I'm not competent to cover so wide a field, and it would be difficult to find a genealogist who could do so. My object here is to merely give the inexperienced amateur and the general reader an idea of what sort of archives exist from which genealogical information can be extracted. For this purpose, I shall limit myself to the archives to be found in Connecticut, the territory which I am most familiar. Many searchers feel, when they visit a historical society and examine its manuscript collections, that they are utilizing original sources. This is rarely the truth, although a few original documents, sometimes the original of a church record, are on deposit in the libraries of historical societies. But the collections consist mainly of copies made by various persons, some by good copyists and others by copyists not so good, of certain original records. The Connecticut Historical Society in Hartford has a most valuable collection, especially copies of church records from all over the state. There are also many compilations arranged by various genealogists, both professional and amateur, who worked in the original sources. It is often useful to consult these collections, provided that one bears in mind that these are not original records and may now and again contain errors or misleading information. Whenever one uses the manuscript collections of professional genealogists which have been acquired by historical societies, it should never be forgotten that these were the genealogist's working notes, drawn from many sources, both original and printed, and that the genealogist himself would probably not have given out the information as it stands to clients. He knew how to use his own notes, and he did not expect that they would be used by strangers, or they might not have been left in their present shape. While useful as clues, they should not therefore be accepted as invariably correct. Other historical societies throughout the state also have valuable manuscript collections in which the searcher must familiarize himself as he expects to make much use of them. A professional genealogist should never give a client material that comes from such collections without specifying that it was taken from a copy and may be subject to correction. The most extensive collections of archives is to be found in the State Library at Hartford. Several state librarians, notably Headley, Goddard, and Brewster, labored ceaselessly for years until the Connecticut State Library has become second to none in the country for the extent and value of its archives. We are now dealing at last with original records and must attempt in limited space to convey some idea of the wealth of material available in the library. Large numbers of documents are filed in big scrapbooks classified by subject, as for example, ecclesiastical affairs, military affairs, private controversies, Revolutionary War, crimes and misdemeanors, etc., and are copiously indexed. A large majority of the probate districts have deposited their files at the state library, where they can readily be consulted by use of the card index covering the whole collection. There are also separate index volumes for each district. At the time of writing, there are still districts that have not deposited their files, and many have deposited only up to 1850. Those not at the library have to be consulted wherever those probate courts are located. Many of the districts cover more territory than a single town, and several towns at various times have been shifted from one probate district to another. The searcher only hopes to achieve the best results must study the history of the probate districts in order to learn where to look for the estates in which he is interested. The Church of Latter-day Saints has provided the library with microfilms of both probate and land record volumes up to 1850, arranged by probate districts and by towns. The probate record volumes often contain matter which is not in the files. This is because in the past documents have been stolen from the files in some districts where laxity formerly prevailed. Some were accidentally destroyed, and in addition, certain entries were made in the record volumes which never had corresponding documents in the files. The files also contain papers of which no copy was ever made in the record volumes, such as unproved wills and other papers which were ordered filed without recording. Hence, one can never feel certain that he has all the information available unless both the files and the record volumes have been searched. The early records of a number of churches, census records for several decades, photostatic copies of census records of other years, files of the Superior Court in which divorce petitions and other documents of interest to the genealogist may be found. Of special importance are the files and record volumes of the county courts, which contain the early probate entries and much else of genealogical interest. The generosity of General Lucius B. Barber has provided the library with copies of the vital records to 1850 of every town in the state. In addition to verbatim copies, the entries have been alphabetically arranged in volumes for each separate town, and finally there is a card index alphabetically arranged covering the entire state. These copies and indices have not been verified, and errors of name and date occur. This does not affect the marvelous utility of the collection, and it saves the searcher much labor, time, and expense. In specific searches, however, the professional genealogist working for clients should be watchful for possible error, remembering that he is not dealing with original documents, but with unverified copies. The riches of the State Library have scarcely been sampled, but we must pass on to other places where original source material is to be found. The probate offices have already been mentioned. Wills and distributions are in the sine qua non of family histories, and the compiler who attempts write one without covering the probate records for generations before 1850 would better write a novel instead, for his genealogy will contain much fiction. Next to probate records, land records are of most value to the genealogist, at least until the late 1700s. The conveyances of real estate teem with genealogical data. A man and his wife who conveyed together often specified that the land was set to her from the estate of her father and mentioned his name, thus solving the identity of a missing wife where no marriage record is found. Sometimes several heirs conveyed property together and stated their relationship to the former owner. Even the names of witnesses to deeds often provide clues unless the justice or clerk who drew the document witnessed it. Many witnesses were relatives or members of the household of the man who gave the deed. In Connecticut, the land records were kept in each separate town. In many states, they are kept at the county seat. Vital records are also kept in each town, and if the genealogist is working in the stated town to cover the land and probate records, he may as well cover the original vital records there instead of using the copy in the state library. He will thus make sure that nothing has been overlooked. The library copy of vital records may give merit for Merrill, Addy for Ackley, A-C-L-Y, or A-C-K-L-E-Y, those being examples of mistakes I have personally noted. There are fewer death records than entries of birth and marriage, and to make good the deficiency in public records, the searcher should try to locate gravestones with the desired death records. Graveyards may not appeal to everyone as pleasant places for research, but stooping to read stones is excellent exercise for the genealogist who is growing stout at his desk. Many small graveyards are hard to find, and once an amateur friend gleefully drove me out not 20 miles from where I had worked all my life and showed me a graveyard I had never heard of. Copies of the stones in many cemeteries are to be seen in various historical society libraries, and these should be consulted. Stones have fallen or the inscriptions have become illegible since earlier copies were made. The inscriptions in some graveyards have been printed in books or magazine articles. Stones standing in the 1930s were copied as a WPA project and are indexed in the state library. Nothing is easier to misread than inscriptions, and it requires long practice to become expert. The figure 4 in dates is oftentimes read as a 1 because the crossbar was cut so lightly in comparison with the downstroke that it has become almost obliterated. The wider spacing, which the 4 required, is in some cases the only clue to the correct figure. The early county court records contain many probate entries because this court sat part of the time as a probate court. The court orders granting administration, acceptance of the will and inventory, appointments of guardians, and orders for distribution, sometimes naming the heirs, were therefore entered in these volumes, while the wills, inventories, etc., were recorded in separate volumes, which later passed into possession of the probate courts. Novices who are searching probate records rarely learn of this, and by neglecting to consult the county records, fail to discover the most valuable information in intestate estates. The searcher should ascertain whether the county court volumes are kept at the county seat or have been deposited in the state library. The church records supply many of the deficiencies of the public records, and the dates of baptism also have to be learned to approximate unrecorded dates of birth. 7 volumes of marriages from Connecticut church records were published by the Reverend Frederick W. Bailey and are useful for quick reference despite a rather high percentage of errors in reading names. And there's an asterisk that says early Connecticut marriages as found in ancient church records prior to 1800, with additions, corrections, introduction by Donald Lyons Jacobus, originally published in 1896 to 1906, now reprinted in 1 volume by the Genealogical Publishing Company of Baltimore. Since most church records are in the hands of the ecclesiastical societies, it is more difficult to gain access to them. Some are kept in the homes of the minister or of the clerk of the church. Others have been deposited for safekeeping in vaults. Copies of many church records can be seen at the historical societies, and the state library has accepted for deposit the early original records of many Connecticut churches. Many have been indexed at the state library. While I have mentioned the most important original source records, others exist for which information can sometimes be gleaned. Files of old newspapers may be consulted for death notices or obituaries. Census and pension records at the National Archives in Washington should furnish their quota of information to the family historian. Shipping records of ports are another original source not much utilized. In working with original sources, always make note of the volume and page of the record volume you take information from, or the name of the district and number of the file if you are using probate files at the state library. Personally, I think such references are not of not much importance, lest I be burned in oil. For this heresy, I will attempt to justify it. The only use for such a reference is if your client or the reader of your book should wish to verify the statement for himself. Since most of the record sources are well indexed, he should have no difficulty in finding the record you quote, whether or not he has the exact reference. Naturally, if you find something by a page or page inspection of unindexed early land records, you would want the reference so as to be able to find it again yourself or to enable your client to find it. Yet there is risk involved. Very often, when an old volume is provided with a modern index, it is found that the original paging was inaccurate, page numbers being omitted or repeated, so the volume is repaged as a preliminary to indexing. When this happens, it makes a liar of any genealogist who has put in print reference to the original page numbers. In one probate district, I discovered the volume themselves had been renumbered, for an excellent abstract had been made of these records some 30 years before, and the numbering of the volumes were different from their present numbering. Many books, full of poorly digested and arranged genealogical matter, are choked up with references of both original and printed sources. References do not, in themselves, guarantee the accuracy of the matter published. I would rather take the unreferenced word of a capable genealogist, either amateur or professional, that he had worked out a line and verified it from original records than trust an incompetent genealogist with all the references in the world. Nevertheless, always take references when you work. It is customary, your client may expect it, and has the right to demand it. While on the subject of heresies, I may as well close the chapter by getting another off my conscience. I don't think it makes an iota of difference whether a man was born in 1700 or 1800, was born on the 17th day of July or on the 18th. Accuracy is important, yes, and the full date should always be copied, just as it appears in the original record. But if you find a town record of death and a church record of the same, and also a record of death of the man's stone, there is a very fair chance that you will have 3 different dates, all from original sources, any one of which may be correct. When I speak of inaccuracies in printed sources, I do not want to be understood as referring to slight discrepancies of this sort, where original records may quite possibly be at variance. These slight differences are of little import. Some people swear by old Bible records. My experience with them, and I have plenty of experience, is that as far as dates are concerned, they are much less reliable than town or church records. Very often, the entries were made after the entire family of children had been born, and in making the record, the parents would figure that Tom was 3 years old in December and was 2 years younger than Nancy, who was born in July, so on from the youngest to the eldest. By the time the date was figured out for the eldest, it was sometimes a year or 2 out of the way. Comparison with church records of baptism for the same family proves how often such mistakes occurred. In rectifying such source errors, always give the date as it appears in the original together with your correction. The State Library, incidentally, has copies of many family and Bible records, and these private records have been typed and indexed. In many cases, they fill gaps in the public records. After the Revolutionary War, the recording of vital statistics fell off badly in most of New England. A law in 1820 in Connecticut required the recording of marriages, but the entry of births and deaths was not resumed until the 1840s. For special conditions in other states and localities, a great deal of information will be found in Genealogical Research Methods and Sources, published by the American Society of Genealogists in 1960. Several good books on the subject have appeared in recent years. I confess a liking for the well-written Searching Your Ancestors by Gilbert H. Doan, 3rd edition, 1960. Especially useful features are found in Archibald F. Bennett's Guide for Genealogical Research, 1951, E.K. Kirkham's Research in American Genealogy, 1956, and Noel C. Stevenson's Search and Research, second edition, 1959. And this ends the chapter. So this has been Craig, this has been Just Genealogy, and this has been Genealogy as Pastime and Profession by Donald Lyons Jacobus. Thank you all so very much for joining me today.